Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Not Overthinking. This is a very special episode, one of the rare episodes in which we have a guest joining us. Today, we have a second-time guest, an even rarer occurrence. I think Jason is now in a company of maybe two or three people who have been multi-time guests on Not Overthinking. If you didn't listen to our episode with Professor Jason Blakely a few months ago, quick bio on Jason. Jason is an associate professor of political science at Pepperdine University in California. He's written a bunch of books, most recently one called Lost in Ideology, which is roughly what we'll be chatting about today, I think. And my interest in Jason's work comes from, I think, his expertise and analysis of the sort of modern ideological arena and how to make sense of it. So, Jason, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much. I really enjoy speaking with you, and yeah, I'm a fan. I also see you have what looks like an ideological image behind you. It looks like you're being stormed by something or someone. What's going on back there?
Yeah, this is it's a Lowry. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know much about the historical context of what he was doing here. I just like the vibes, to be honest.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, great to have you with us, Jason. And unfortunately, Ali can't be with us today. Ali has been on some kind of company retreats the last couple of weeks, but we may do a follow up with Ali. I think I'm already on pretty on board with Jason's shtick. I'll try and still sort of push back on some things and have a more balanced discussion. But I think Ali usually kind of plays that role. But we'll see.
Yes.
We'll see how we can do. So before we get into the book, actually, I want to congratulate you because you now have a legit Wikipedia page. I discovered at some point in the last couple of months, like you now have like a serious Wikipedia page.
I know, and I don't know if that just means that you're actually legit or it means that you're very, illegitimate and some rando just put you on Wikipedia, but I noticed that as well. My mom's like, "You're on Wikipedia." I don't know what that means. For some reason, I've landed now. I'm finally
Nice, you made
somebody.
it.
Uh,
Yeah, how does that feel? I mean, it sounds like you already care too much about these things.
I mean, Wikipedia is so odd, right? Because anyone can edit it. On the other hand, it's sort of impressive with the controls it has, and the
Hmm.
article seems very accurate. I don't see anything on there that I grind my teeth at or anything. So, yeah, we'll see. I guess any of your listeners can now go on and sabotage it with anything they want to put up there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they can add like a criticism subheading and whatever.
exactly, exactly.
Um, nice. So I'm keen to unpack a bunch of the stuff that you talk about in Lost in Ideology, and actually, I think a bunch of stuff that's also not really in the book. And I think a good sort of I think the sort of layperson's usage and understanding of the word ideology is that it's kind of an offensive term, right?
Yeah.
And this is a point that you make in the intro of your book, and I dug up a couple of sort of funny tweets just to like, sort of highlight that this is how most people seem to use the word ideology. So the first tweet, so actually this is someone else pointing this out, but basically it turns out that Jordan Peterson has some like new academy or something, and part of the tagline is that it's supposed to be education devoid of ideology. That's in the tagline.
Wow.
And then when you read the like about page or whatever, it says pro-Western, pro-private property, and pro-tradition. So it's devoid of ideology, which is bad. But then it has a bunch of these positions on things. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And then there's a guy, Greg Lukianoff. I think you're familiar with this guy. He's kind of written. I think he wrote like The Coddling of the American Mind. These
Right.
kinds of sort of books. And he tweeted in May. He tweeted, "Ideology is what we use to turn IQ points against themselves." And then, some people in the prize were like, "Wow, this is like, great one, Greg. I love it. You're so true." you know. So yeah, I mean, how do you think about sort of defining ideology? I mean, do you think these guys are right? Do you think Greg is right that like ideology? You don't think that, but like, yeah, it would be good to hear how you think about the concept of ideology.
Well, if we really want to blow the minds of the likes of Jordan Peterson, we'll simply point out that he is using the Marxist definition of ideology. And that's not meant to be fighting words. It's just meant to be sociologically, historically, an account of where the usage of ideology as a slander or false consciousness comes from. Karl Marx is the first person to use the word ideology in that way. The person who invented the term ideology, a much lesser known thinker of the Enlightenment, a Frenchman named de Tracy, he used ideology as a science of ideas. So the exact opposite of the pejorative. Like And you even see it in the etymology, right? Like ideasology, like a study of ideas that will finally get us to scientific politics. So you have these two kind of opposing definitions. Ideology is just pure science and reason, and then Marx's takeover of the term as false consciousness, justifying some ruling classes' interests, but essentially false beliefs or distorted beliefs that justify power structures, which weirdly is how everyone uses it now. I almost want to be invited on Fox News to say, is this cultural Marxism that we're using it all in this way? But my take in the book is that both of those are wrong. And even though they seem like polar opposites, those are like the most common deployments of one's politics today, is to either assume that the opponent is completely ideological and their beliefs are sort of non-cognitive, non-rational, and then that one's own beliefs are completely scientific or rational or common sense or just practical reasoning or traditional and pre-ideological or whatever it is. And my view instead, I'm working out of the tradition of hermeneutics, interpretivism, phenomenology. But my view is that ideologies have both positive and negative functions. We can't do without them. They can certainly lead to blinders, what I call lost in ideology in the book, but they're also just non-optional because the modern world is a living artifact of our various ideologies. And so even when we think we're not dealing with ideology, we're participating in its rituals, practices from before we can understand. We're using things like money, we're standing in line, we're voting or not voting, and so on. So we may not be articulate about our ideologies, but they're what I call world making in the book. So we're always living in them partly.
Nice. Yeah. And so if someone feels like, you often, yeah, it does seem like the way people use the term is to sort of oppose ideology on the one hand with something objective on the other, science or the facts or, data, whatever it might be. But you're basically saying, look, ideology is one of those things that you can't really opt out of it. It's just a question of whether you can articulate your own ideology or whether you can't.
Exactly. Yeah. It's non optional and there's positive features to it. They're what I call ethically magnetic in the book. They give us some vision of a good life, a good political life at the sort of communal level. And, they help guide us through our existing social spaces. I take over this famous definition by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz that they're maps. And I'm not entirely on board with Clifford Geertz, but I do start from him. And, so the idea that you orient with them and that we would be completely disoriented without ideologies. So you can think of it as tragic, you can think of it as a step forward. But I think that the human situation in the modern world is ideologies for now are here to stay. No one can really see how they're going to go away. And they do some things that we need doing. And so like in that sense, we have to live with and live inside these various maps. And so it would be better to become aware that one participates in an ideology. That's a lot of what the book is about, is that becoming unlost. And in some senses, I mean, someone asked me a while back, so you think you ever get totally unlost in ideology since the name of your book is Lost in Ideology? No, you're always somewhat lost in ideology. Like we're now, myself included. But one way to begin to get slightly unlost is to become aware of the fact, okay, I have an ideological tradition. It's cultural. It's non-obvious. It's not just nature. It's not just science. It's not just common sense. It's something people have to get the hang of, just like they would have to get the hang of a language or a religion or anything else that's cultural.
Yep. Yeah, I think you often, I mean, I think since getting interested in your work and just kind of reading around these sort of topics over the last couple of years, you often see online, people saying something along the lines of, oh, I don't have an ideology. I just think you should let people do what they want as long as it's not harming anyone. Or, they'll
Yeah.
say, I don't have an ideology, and then that sort of state something pretty,
That's why you should get vaccinated now, or that's why you should start the revolution, or that's why you should invest in finance capital. Yeah,
yeah,
that's when you can be sure that the most naive ideological formulation is being teed up next. As
right.
soon as someone says, "I don't have ideology," that to me is symptomatic of being completely lost in it because you're not even aware that you're in it, so to speak.
Yeah, there's a good quote. I don't know if I came across this quote through your book. It's from John Maynard Keynes, the economist. He said practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. So I thought that was that was pretty funny. And I think I I mean I found this quite eye opening when I first sort of you know got into this rabbit hole. And I think it's partly because you know, but yeah, before reading around this, I think I would have, been in the like, yeah, man, like I don't really have an ideology sort of thing, you know? It's not like I've read some manifesto or whatever. I'm just like, there are just certain things that seem intuitive and neutral, actually. And I think, I mean, I'm curious whether you think this is a particularly modern predicament, but I think, the sort of the modern sort of layperson, when approaching things like, politics or religion, or, just anything that kind of touches the ideological sort of arena, we want to try to be objective. I think we have this feeling that, hey, the sound way to approach this is to try and be neutral, to remove bias. We want to be objective and not subjective. And so there's this kind of impulse to try and analyze all of these things, sort of removed from time and place. We want to sort of step out of our bodies and sort of become these sort of just some disembodied floating mind,
Mm-hmm.
looking down at the sort of world, and we kind of take that to be the proper starting point for our analysis. And I think this is often referred as like the view from nowhere.
Yeah.
Now, I know you don't think this is actually a good, even a possible starting point to take this nowhere approach. I think a lot of listeners will probably be thinking, as I described that, they'll be thinking, yeah, I mean, obviously you want to be objective, you want to step out of time and place, and et cetera. You want to be neutral. Yeah, what's your view on the sort of view from nowhere approach when coming at these topics, and what even is an alternative?
Yeah, I think that it's again one of these paradoxical situations where, of course, I mean, who could be against being objective? I'm all in favor of being objective. I'm not a relativist. I'm very concerned with truth in politics. The problem is, what is our conception of objectivity? And that's where you get into the view from nowhere is I think we have a bad conception of what it means to become objective that comes from the natural sciences. And that notion of what it means to be objective in the natural sciences is wonderful. If I'm studying atomic particles or chemical compounds, placing myself historically and culturally within the study or bringing to light inarticulate things about my autobiography is completely irrelevant. There's a reason to bracket those first person aspects of life. However, I think that when we try to do the view from nowhere in politics, it's mission impossible because the object of study is itself constituted by our self understanding. So when we try to do that, what we inevitably do is hide the sort of background culture that we're participating in, ethical, religious, political, and it ends up cropping up anyway in a very naive or sort of philosophically illegitimate way. And so I think one way to put this is when you're studying human beings, healthy human beings, they're cultural animals, and what you're dealing with are their traditions of meaning, their practices of meaning, and that how we become objective about that in ethics and politics is different than how we become objective in the sciences. If I can give an example really quickly, take someone like, that attempts a view from nowhere, who's like a social scientist, and they say, okay, I'm going to be completely value neutral. I'm going to be ideology free. And by the way, there is a place for this in the social sciences. So, maybe you run a big, large N, variable analysis of people's views on something, with a mass survey or something like that. Wonderful. But the problem is if all of your study of politics becomes that sort of view from nowhere, supposed objectivity, two things happen. One is you can't self-narrate why you're concerned with what you're concerned with, the significance question. So like, why do you care about electoral politics and not say as much policing or homelessness or something like that? And usually an ideological framework is in the background governing that. But two, and I think this is an even bigger issue, is that the social sciences imply a kind of relativism or nihilism in the sense that they imply that scientific consciousness can't actually make any progress on these thick ethical and political issues. So that's another one of these paradoxical situations where two things that look opposed, the sort of objective scientific worldview and relativism, are actually in a kind of weird symbiosis with each other, in my view, where the standard of objectivity demanded by the natural sciences, when it's a standard that can't be met in ethics and politics, leads to the exact opposite. Everything is relative, Nietzschean sort of, voluntaristic worry. And there's this whole middle ground that's lost, which is what I want to occupy, which is how do we become objective? How do we make progress on truth questions when we're dealing with rival traditions, meanings, etc.?
Okay, I think I can follow. So that was quite an abstract sort of answer, which I think I followed, but I think it would be helpful. I think there might be people listening who are still thinking, well, like, it still seems better to be unbiased. And, if my starting point is that, you know, I grew up in the UK in, the 1990s and 2000s, then like, I should somehow remove my cultural and, cultural baggage and traditions and and so on. Like, can you get a bit more specific as to, yeah, maybe more practically, like, suppose I am I'm like I'm a university student in, let's say, like, say, the sciences, or maths or something.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't really, I don't know what a lot of these words mean that you said. I haven't really read anything around this. It just seems intuitive to me that, like, hey, uh, you know, yeah, I guess all this kind of Cartesian sort of stuff of, like, look, I'm sort of a skeptic about stuff. I mean, how do we even know, the real world exists? Are we brains, and, are we in a simulation? The only thing I can really be sure of is that I exist. What's the route out of that? Because I mean, certainly speaking for myself a few years ago,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very hard to conceive of like an alternative.
Yeah, I think one way at this, and that's fair enough, that's a good point, is say you want to just be hard nosed and look at the data to get clear on politics or ideology, because I accept that there are domains in which, doing data analysis might be very helpful. But say what you want is sort of ideology free, value free, just a data account of politics. The problem that emerges, the claim that I'm making, is that there's always a background field of significance or interpretation that is doing data selection. So, what data I find relevant and what I point my questions to is going to already involve interpretation. And the problem with the I'm just giving you the data or the mere facts is that what's really going on is a very inarticulate or background hidden interpretation of what we think the relevant facts are. So let me give an example of this. A big one here in the United States recently was the pandemic, right? There was a sort of attempt to establish policy through data or through numbers. And, in a way, I want to say, well, I want to say, okay, of course, like viral spread, impact on hospitals, rate of death, and everything. That's all very relevant. However, the problem was that the numbers were said to be determinative of the policy. And there, whether or not I agree with the policy, and often, honestly, I did agree with the policy of, like, let's take care of vulnerable people, et cetera, let's listen to the scientists. But the problem was that it was being presented as though the data already determined the significance. And the data never determined the significance, or rather are sort of like Trojan horses hiding in inarticulate significance. So if I say to you, look, viral spread and this rate of fatality just means we have to close the schools or close the churches or close your businesses, that's assuming that the data as just facts establish the politics for us. But they don't, because what's hidden there is an interpretive view of what is the highest vision of life. Like, it might be a right to life in a kind of Hobbesian sense, or, what Agamben scandalously called bare life, just, living over and above other goods like schooling, sociality, burying people, religious ritual, whatever it might be. And so my problem with the sort of hard-nosed maths, science people is they overestimate, the ability of data to resolve our ideological problems. I'm not against data. The problem is that it's a different field. It's a field in which we're living out meaning questions. Ideology is a meaning question. Human life is a meaning question. And all the data in the world doesn't resolve the significance issue. Instead, it usually imports something there. I mean, you even think of, like, which data we line up. Do we line up how many kids became anxious and antisocial during the lockdowns? Or do we line up how many businesses were lost? Or do we line up how many elderly people died, et cetera, et cetera? And behind the data selection, I would tell the hard-nosed sort of math people, there is a significance or interpretive question. And we're so inarticulate on the interpretive significance question, but that's exactly what ideology is. And to just land the point, I think that's non-optional. Ideology always crops back in when you're talking about politics and ethics. In most naive way when you think it's not there. Then you just don't know that it's there. You don't know that you're making ideological claims. You think you're just making science claims.
Right. Yeah, there's a quote from one of your other books, the sort of anti-naturalism book, where you're referring to Charles Taylor, and you say that one of his things is that the values that we have don't derive deductively from atomistic statements of fact. Instead, they subtly pervade larger ontological and explanatory frameworks. And I think Taylor also has this concept of value slope, where, whatever this, behind, if you can sort of go a step further than like whatever values, someone would claim to hold, there is some broader explanatory framework, ontological framework that they're using to even look at the categories through which they see the world and make sense of the world. And that framework, has some kind of slope where it pulls you towards certain positions when it comes to ethics and politics and things like this. And so the values are kind of like secreted by the framework, in kind of an invisible way. And I think I think if I sort of reflect on the kind of sort of armchair, like thinking about life kind of stuff that I would have done as a teenager, just like in the shower or something. I think there's some kind of explanatory framework, if we can call it that, that sort of led me to a certain position that made certain positions seem very intuitive and other positions seem not very intuitive. So I'd say, for sort of like a modern sort of scientifically minded person, the sort of you're kind of led to, I think, some kind of utilitarianism, some kind of naturalism when it comes to metaphysics, and this kind of like Cartesian struggle of like, deep skepticism of like, how do we ground down, you just kind of like epistemology, how do we ground, knowledge, like what, is this objective, what are the fact, this kind of sort of battle. And this was all for me. This was all sort of pre-theory. It's not like I read a book that was like, hey, Descartes said this thing, and like he was he was right about that, and that's your starting point. It's obviously there's some kind of like diffuse process that happens over your entire life where you sort of get these ideas. But I'm curious if you can kind of make a bit more tangible how sort of 17, 18-year-old me just kind of intuited these ideas that are sort of quite peculiar to our time and place without really realizing it.
Yeah, and that's a really helpful sort of rundown of some of the background notions here, because one way to make the kind of paradigm shift that's needed to see what's going on here, because it really, I would ask any listener who's skeptical that you need to sort of exercise your imagination to understand what's being said in this other rival paradigm, and try it on. And then that doesn't mean you just accept it, but really to get the hang of what's being said. And one way at it is the way that you were talking, which is, if we set up little atomistic bits of data, it's kind of easy to be like, okay, where are the values, man? Like, where's the ideology? It's a fact that many people died in the hospital, right? Or whatever it is. And the problem is, as you said, it's actually that the way values show up in human political life is as a part of a whole system. And Charles Taylor is so important here. He's a wonderful philosopher. For those who are not listeners who are not aware of him, just absolutely brilliant. Now in his 90s, but has been working for decades at the top of his field and whatnot. And he's one of the forerunners of this argument that I take up. And what is going on in the background, what you could think of is, yeah, there are value slopes there, but maybe some more intuitive word would be stories. That there's some narrative or story, and the story itself has some kind of ethical arc or value to it that is doing the selection of the data. That's another way of saying that, there's always a pre-interpretation going on when we select data. Another way to say that is there's always a story. Now, as a teenager, why am I already sort of ritualized or part of the practices of different stories? Well, part of the cognitive leap you've got to make is to see the world from this perspective, is that stories, which sound like a genre for kids or pre-modern people, on this view are something, they're non-optional. We live them. We might not be articulate about them, but we're already organizing our life around certain priorities, a goal, and the way that the genre by which we make sense of our ordering of our goals, of what's highest, what's lowest, is a story. There's no way to just tell that in terms of like the language of science. And so what's going on is, when we're born, we're already midway in a story, socially, politically. And one of the ways we're lost in ideology, my contention is that we're born into different traditions. You narrated a situation in which the most proximate traditions would have been sort of utilitarian, maybe a certain liberal disengagement, get to know the facts, free of ideology. But other people are born in a situation. There are other ways to be lost in ideology. Sometimes you'll hear conservatives say they don't have ideology because they just believe in sort of practical judgment, and they're not making some big totalizing theory of politics. They're just accepting the inherited customs. So there's no ideology here. These are just the customs I find around me. And I think that's another way to be lost in ideology. But the thing that joins both the person who's sort of a naive or pre-philosophical utilitarian. I don't mean naive here as in not intelligent. You could be incredibly smart. It's just you sort of think you're in your little tribe, in your cultural world, everyone thinks this way. They think of cost-benefit analysis. They think, let's look at the data, and that they're not being ideological. They're just being rational. You can likewise grow up in a milieu where everyone thinks, you know what, we're not very ideological. We just sort of accept the, time-honored customs and traditions of our place, and that's not ideology. That's just something that we cobble together practically mindedly and whatnot. What both those share is a story that is sort of so close that it's rendered us kind of provincial. And one thing my book is trying to do is it offers a new theory of ideology, but it also tries to give a kind of tour of ideologies that's almost like a travel log tour, so you get the sense of other cultures. Because what I do think happens is people never leave their small town ideologically. They're brushing up in our societies constantly against people of other ideologies, but they basically think they're completely whacked out and stupid, and that only their little town, their little tribe, their province has the only like non-ideological way to configure politics. And that to me is, a paradigmatic case of being what I call lost in ideologies, not realizing your story is a story. It's a rival story amongst other stories. Okay, good. Now, how do we become objective about these rival stories? That's what we need to become
Yep.
objective about. Not let go of the data, but realize we're all dealing with background stories or frameworks. Now, how do we argue about those? That would be a more intelligent argument, than just throwing data at each other's head or saying, I just have common sense or I'm just practical, unlike you, whatever, liberals or leftists that have like these high theory ideas, I just have customs. That's not a very fruitful conversation to have.
And so, what is the kind of background story that sort of teenage me, or actually just as another example, I was talking to
Yeah.
sort of a friend recently. I think he was like in a long-term relationship now, thinking about getting married, eventually having kids, and this kind of stuff. And we were kind of talking about raising kids or something like this. Um, and I think his sort of view was like, oh, yeah, I mean, I would just like teach the kids the sort of objective stuff, and just and let them just decide on everything, something like this, like hey, it's my role to kind of teach them the objective stuff, and then it's up to them um, about everything else. And I think this is sort of not an uncommon type,
Yeah.
not an uncommon pattern of thought. I mean, let's just to sort of pinpoint, sort of put a
Yeah.
name on. Let's just call it the sort of tech bro
Mm.
sort of view on things of like, hey, this part, but this politics stuff is just silly. It's what these like, other people are over there arguing about. I'm just sort of rational and pragmatic, and I'm in the real world, and I just care about the objective stuff. And those guys can like waste their time with this, with this other stuff. Like, what is the story that is pulling? What is the story that the sort of tech bro has picked up in the water over the course of their life that is pulling them towards that kind of position?
Well, one fascinating thing that's happened in ideology, I don't know that it's good, at least in the United States. I might be speaking more parochially here. Is what I know the genre, the type of the tech bro, but the tech bro started out as a left thing in the early aughts, or just a center left liberal. So usually if you said tech bro, it meant like you were kind of liberal, progressive. But then it became hybridized or combined with other ideologies. So look at someone like Elon Musk, who maybe is like the king of the tech bros, but he seems to have become a Trumpist or sort of right wing. And so it depends what's in the bundle of just facts you're teaching people. You went through the Jordan Peterson sort of all we believe in here is private property, and I forgot the other things you said. So
Yeah.
different tech bros will actually teach their children different ideological
Yeah.
maps or regimes in there. The family resemblance the tech bro has, and I think there's a reason why we tend to think immediately, even though it has its limits. We all recognize this, but that as a male, a young man, usually a young man who's maybe got a certain amount of professional education in engineering or math or business or science, there tends to be family resemblances around a kind of ethic of disengagement and rational control. And so it's very rare to have tech bros go in for some of the more expressivist ideologies, be those like sort of religious conservatism or ethical socialism or something like that. They tend to gravitate toward technocratic strains of the various ideologies. And that's because what they're doing is they're applying their view of what maybe they think of the natural sciences or their discipline in engineering, and they're thinking, that's more or less how I think about everything. It's like that old saying about someone with a hammer, all problems are nails. And so they sort what the ethical vision there is, look, I can do, it's a neo-stoicism. Charles Taylor calls it a neo-stoicism. The good self, the ethical self, is a self that can stand back from my commitments and sort of think in a cool-headed, rational way about social problems, life problems. But that itself is a kind of answer to what the good life is, both at the individual and at the communal level. And it's not a neutral answer. I could say, well, think of like the Romantics. To hell with that, like what is it, the Sorrows of Young Werther? It was a phenomenon in Germany, kicked off Romanticism. Goethe, like Werther walks around crying all the time. They're like tears coming down his face all the time. I'm not saying, maybe call this the emo bro, but like the original emo bro, but like you can't neutrally answer the question of what it is to properly live out a life. That's already an answer to ethical political questions.
Right.
And people who think they're just that again is to me lost in ideologies. Like, well, I'm just living the neutral option out. No, you're living a neo-stoic ethic of control in which you think the way you really live a good life is you get a kind of analytic control on all your problems.
Can we dig into the word rational a little bit? I feel like this is another sort of quite a fraught term that's sort of thrown around for sort of various purposes, as an insult or whatever. What's the, I think certainly everyone would aspire to be rational, right? Like no one would say, well, I'm just not that, I'm not a rational kind of guy, everyone would aspire to be rational. It seems like there are some people that call themselves rationalists. And then there's a lot of accusations of like, oh well, those guys are irrational. The rational thing would be the like, this my particular thing of whatever my ideology is or whatever. Like how should like a sort of normal person understand this concept of rational, and how can we spot when it's kind of other things are being smuggled in, an ideology is being smuggled in under the guise of rationality?
Yeah, so that's great. And by the way, I can't help but bring up Fyodor Dostoevsky here, the great Russian novelist, because he was so put off by utilitarian reasoning that somewhere or other he says he tried to do one irrational thing a day just to like confound the utilitarians. So there apparently Dostoevsky wanted to be irrational, but no, I take your point, which is he didn't want to be rational in the narrow utilitarian sense. So he was trying to do things that didn't fit the calculus of like summing up pleasures or social benefit or something like that. And certainly you're right that it depends how you define rationality. And if you define it broadly enough, who doesn't want to be rational? It's rather, a better way to think about it is probably that there are rival conceptions of rationality itself. And when the way I was deploying it, which is typical in the history of political thought, is as the sort of conception that comes out of, you could hang it on someone like Descartes. I mean, it's a much more complicated story than that. But the idea that a sort of freestanding reason can, through sort of formal logic, resolve human problems, philosophical problems in all areas. And so you'd think, well, what drops out of that? Like what drops out of if you have a rationalist account of reason, in which basically like mathematics and logic are the canonical ways to think about things. Well, one thing that drops out is the thing I keep going on about, which is how do we advance in our understanding of interpretive phenomenon, of meanings, of stories. And if your approach is that the only way you really get reasonable is you turn something into a deductive argument or a syllogism, or you formally map it out as logic, or you do the cost benefit analysis or the math, these are all rationalist approaches in which formal rationality resolves the problem. But then stories start to look really like a child's thing. They look like, or at best they look beautiful, or an entertainment. Sure, I'll watch that movie with you, but they don't look like a broader conception of reason, what you could think of as a more substantive as opposed to just formal conception of reason. Is there a rationality to storytelling such that Shakespeare is, if you like, the most rational person around, because what he has to say about our stories is substantively more insightful, sheds more light on different meaning issues. And I would take it that we need to, one of the reasons I'm critical of rationalism as getting lost in ideology is that it can't self-narrate. The deductive analysis goes on against the background, again, of a story, kind of like with the data issue, that goes unacknowledged. And the thing that I think modern people are very superstitious, bad at, is thinking into stories better. And this is, again, the bad influence of the natural sciences. By the way, I think the natural sciences are wonderful for listening. Like, I'm not anti-natural science. I just think we have a particular way of getting off the rails, which is we take things that we think are paradigmatic about the natural science or evolution, like it's just hard-nosed on the data, or it gets really clear on the math and the logic, and then we think that's going to resolve all our problems. And then what we lose, or we become depleted in, impoverished in, is a more substantive, thicker conception of rationality. Like, how would we become rational about stories and interpretation? And that's a huge issue there, by the way, because I also think that's how we would have better ideological arguments. We'd have better ideological arguments if we learn to argue about, okay, but why are you interpreting the significance of politics in that way and not this way? As opposed to, I have a rational deductive argument that's going to get you off of your vision of what's good. That never happens, would be my contention. No one switches ideologies because of a syllogism, or because someone ran the math properly. They're
Right.
much more demanding than that. They're ethically demanding because they have this magnetic sort of, infinite demanding vision to them. They're closer to poetics in that way. They have a vision of something.
I think most of the sort of, I think it's in the sort of modern world. I think because you and I live in sort of these liberal, Western societies. I think it's often it's easy to get lost in ideology, where the sort of liberal lens of looking at the world just seems like the sort of the original position, or the state of whatever, like, right. It just seems like the default starting point, and it's unless you're sort of aware of other options that actually seem valid when they're presented to you, it can seem like, well, I'm not really making any assumptions when I'm taking the view from nowhere. I'm not really making any assumptions, if I'm behind Rawls's veil of ignorance, or in whatever, like, original position, whatever state of nature, whatever liberal theorist is proposing. I'm not really making any assumptions there. This really does feel sort of completely neutral. And so, could you maybe, for someone, for someone who might be thinking this, for example, for teenage me, for example, can you sort of pinpoint where, what is, why am I actually not being neutral, and where's the subjectivity in my sort of view from nowhere in Rawls's original position?
Yeah. Well, one way to get at this is just to point out that as a sociological fact, the rational Enlightenment has a similar problem to which the Christian religion had around the time of the Reform, which is that the assumption was if you translate the Bible into the vernacular, there's going to be a consensus around what reasonable Christianity is around the Bible. Instead, what you had is the multiplication of authority, so you have countless forms of Christianity, each with rival claims to the right interpretation. Now, this is fighting words, but the rational Enlightenment, instead of all the people who were partisans of it saying, oh yeah, there's the one paradigm or argument that really works, it's Rawls's original position, or it's Locke's state of nature, or it's Nozick, or it's Karl Marx, instead, or it's utilitarianism. Instead, the Enlightenment as a rationalist program generated rival enlightenments. And that is a huge problem for it on its own terms, because it's very hard to claim, well, only John Rawls is rational while, Bentham or Mill are completely irrational. At the very least, it looks like people of goodwill who are extremely brilliant at the deployment of reason. Because, I mean, who's going to say John Rawls and J.S. Mill and Bentham aren't brilliant at the deployment of reason, or Karl Marx for that matter?
Sorry, do you
Instead
mind
of,
just sort of summing up the kind of general approach of sort of liberal theorists about, like, how, the sort of, the original position, state of nature sort of stuff for the sort of layperson who
yeah.
isn't familiar with these things?
Yeah, and Lost in Ideology begins with, for instance, John Locke's really famous story of a state of nature. That one you can get out really quickly, which is just that he thought that if you roll back, politics, the state, culture, people in a state of nature will recognize that they have a primordial right to private property and to the extraction of private property from the commons. And so it's like, what that means is we're naturally liberal, in short. A certain kind of liberal, by the way, classical liberal, in which, the market is natural, religion's not natural, politics isn't natural. What's natural is I own my person and I own the stuff I extract from the commons. Slightly different story in John Rawls. I mean, Rawls was also a liberal, but he was a social liberal or progressive liberal. And what he thought is that if you engaged earnestly and rationally in a thought experiment in which you imagined yourself, as you said, Taimur, behind a veil of ignorance, in which you didn't know what position you would occupy in society, you didn't know anything about your abilities, you didn't know anything about where you came from, that you would choose principles for a social contract, for a just society, a fair society, that included both classical liberal principles of freedom that are like the Lockean ones I just sort of flicked at, but also a right to sort of a bare minimum right to well-being that undergirds the welfare state. So like a floor on your well-being. Like you wouldn't agree to be in a society where you have no basically like right to subsistence through a minimum, living wage or something like that. So in both these stories, what you have is they're very different in a lot of ways. And, bravo Rawls, it's like brilliant how different his story is. And you could have an entire podcast episode easily on Rawls. But what both of them sort of think is that human beings subtracted back to their absolutely essential nub will basically be proto-liberal in either their intuitions or in their anthropology and practices like Locke. And so like people are either naturally, or if they're really being rational, just liberal. And I think this is not, I mean, don't have time to like lay this out, but not only do I think these are bad arguments philosophically, but what they lead to is the bad assumption that your particular political culture is just like somehow glaringly or blindingly obvious. And what it produces is a mass movement of politics in which people just shout about how rational they are to other people, but have no way to form the bridge over. It's very exasperating in that sense as a political experience, because it feels like what you're presenting is just 2 + 2 = 4. But people aren't hearing 2 + 2 = 4. And even more vexing, you'll occasionally run into someone who looks like they can do the math better than you, but they don't agree with you that progressivism is just 2 + 2 = 4. And that's very vexing because, and mostly people buffer themselves from that experience in the United States. But when you find someone who is, the problem isn't their intelligence, but somehow doesn't have the consensus around a normal science, the way, okay, you get physics, you get math, now why don't you get liberalism? And in fact, even if I could say one more thing, liberalism has rival strains. So the Lockean strain is in contest, as Robert Nozick showed, with the John Rawls strain. So the problems get even more kind of wicked for the ideology on its own terms, which is you actually have a multiplicity of liberalisms. You don't just have one liberalism. And it's very hard to say, well, the problem here is that these people aren't rational enough, at least on my view. It looks like the problem is they're being recruited into different visions of what's meaningful or significant, and that liberalism, which has a lot to say for it, morally, ethically, politically, by the way. I'm not just like some anti-liberal or something like that, but liberalism really suffers from inarticulacy about its own moral sources, precisely because it's so vested in these traditions of sort of rationalist, scientific reasoning. And so it tends to be very bad about talking or defending its own goods. And so whenever its goods are in crisis, and people like in the United States right now, a lot of people are like, I don't want to be liberal anymore. All the liberal can do is sort of exasperatedly say, well, you're not being rational. But what they can't do is actually make a case for their own thick vision of a good life. They don't have resources for that because they just think it should be obvious. It should be 2 + 2 = 4, you know? And if you were just rational, you would see that too.
So to the but to if we can dig in a little bit more there, what would you say to the liberal who says, "Well, I'm kind of with Rawls, man. Like that is the default position. You know, if we stripped away time and place, that is the default position, or it, what would you say to the liberal who thinks like, sure, maybe Rawls didn't have it exactly right, maybe Locke didn't have it exactly right, but like, 95%, some combination of like those two guys and maybe a few other people, the kind of rough gist of this, really does seem like the default starting point, the sort of original human nature, like,
Yeah.
what would you
Well,
say
what I
to
say,
that?
yeah, well, one of the governing metaphors of the book I take from Jorge Luis Borges and this short story he has where an empire tries to build, a map that's the size of the territory itself. And I use that as a governing metaphor for being lost in ideology. I think we're lost in ideology whenever our map, our cultural map, is so big that we kind of unroll it over the whole world and it cuts off our access to reality. So we don't actually have access to the cultural realities around us, and we're not very, and that can include ourselves, by the way. We might not be very good at narrating ourselves. So the book starts out with an example. Locke is a little easier than Rawls, I'll admit, because Rawls is more philosophically formidable in my view than Locke. Though I do think he's basically made a similar mistake. But Locke not only made the mistake of everyone is naturally liberal, but it had absolutely catastrophic consequences politically because when that ideology arrived in the New World, I'd have this example of the famous trading of Manhattan supposedly with the indigenous there. Oh, and what a bunch of saps! They gave it over for some beads and hatchets and things. Well, the assumption on the European side was that they had made a contractual exchange of property, which is exactly what Locke would expect. In the second treatise, he says all the Americas are the state of nature. They're all sort of proto-capitalist. But what it seems like what historians tell us is the indigenous didn't actually have a concept of the private alienation of property. Instead, what they probably thought was it was a goodwill trade that meant we can temporarily for some time share these like hunting and gathering grounds with you newcomers. So what happened there is that the assumption that we're just naturally liberal led to a massive misunderstanding, manipulation, violence toward another people, that were treated as though they were just proto-liberals. And you think, oh, that's way in the past. We don't do that anymore. But what was the Iraq War? It was like, hey, we'll just bomb you guys into liberalism because surely if we remove Saddam Hussein and surely if we then remove radical Islam, all of you are liberals there, right? You're just waiting for us once we roll back and subtract away the culture, the government. So liberals tend to have a real blind spot for if we just subtract away your religion, we just subtract away your culture, you're like us, right? And it leads to self-defeating consequences because they don't actually have contact with the social reality there. That's not to say that liberalism is wrong. That would be a longer argument. It's to say that version of liberalism is the how it's being justified is very bad. And it's bad both in terms of not being able to self-narrate as a political culture, but it's also bad in that it leads to self-defeating consequences, non-clairvoyance for the very liberal actors and what they want out of politics. Even now we're having that with Trumpism. It's like, well, everyone please be rational again. I mean, liberals have a real blind spot for the problem with Trump is that he's mentally ill. No, that is not the problem with Trump. You know, like his problem is not that he's mentally ill. I agree, he's erratic, et cetera, et cetera. But his politics is not the equivalent of just like some bout of irrationality, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think another good metaphor you use in the book is that we're all kind of in our own sort of ideological towers. We've kind of constructed these, elaborate, tall ideological towers, and we're kind of all residing in our separate towers. And even though we might all share some similar words, we might all have some concept of called freedom and justice and dignities. Even though we might have some shared words, it's really more like we speak completely different languages. And so when we're sort of yelling at each other from one tower to the next tower about like our freedom or like justice or dignity or tolerance or whatever, we're actually not we're speaking different languages, and what we don't realize is actually we need to learn the other language and vice versa before there's any kind of shared starting point or shared understanding from which we can actually debate these things.
Exactly. Well put. Yeah. And so I think that a lot of what I'm going for in the book is Back to your objectivity question, one tactic of objectivity is what is called in philosophy immanent critique, which is kind of a big term. But one way you can be objective about these holistic meaning things is you can put pressure on people's own stories by showing the ways in which they're incoherent on their own terms or leading to self-defeating problems. I would hold that it's a much more effective strategy if you're in an ideological debate with someone to try to find the internal pressure that's there. And instead, what we do, at least in American society largely, is we assume our own ideological language and then we declare ourselves triumphant over the rival on our own terms. But it actually never touches them. They feel like they were never listened to and it just wasn't a serious objection. Whereas if you can get in, if you know the story, you can get in and find the pressure points. If you know the person and if you know their different moral sources, like even when you were asking about the tech bro earlier, part of me wants to say, well, we need to know a lot more about who we're talking about here, because part of how you argue an ideology is particular to location and person. You need to know what meanings they have so that you can draw on them. And that's a more effective way than just demanding that people immediately speak the language of, say, conservatism, liberalism, nationalism, whatever it is to go into the other's language, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I want to talk. So I don't want us to come across like we're, you know, bashing liberalism or something. 'Cause, I
No,
mean, it's
yeah.
just sort of the dominant thing, and so I think
Yeah.
it's a good starting point. But this isn't some like you know, reactionary sort of like anti-liberal, you know,
Agreed.
thing. Can you sort of? I mean, my general understanding is that the sort of the sort of the sort of basic liberal impulse is to kind of to remove obligations and constraints on people that they didn't intentionally opt into, and the sort of basic conservative impulse is kind of like, hey, let's not mess things up. You know, we got it pretty good. Let's not like rock the boat too much. I mean, how would you? You know, and I'm not talking about sort of U.S. political position or UK, you know, conservative party. I'm talking about sort of liberal and conservative in the sort of broad sense. You know, there does seem to be some impulse in some people that's kind of, you know, that we can call liberal, and a different thing that we can call conservative. Like what's kind of the essence? Do you think is my understanding roughly right on that?
Yeah, even though I wouldn't say it's a natural impulse so much as like cultures that we're socialized into. And I think
Oh, sure,
that,
sure,
yeah, you could be socialized or grow up in a culture, since these maps are world making, they're not just in our head, where you're sort of in the rituals of that we talked about, you know, of okay, let's listen closely to science, let's take care about data, and that can sort of have a certain synergy or feed into liberalism. By the way, liberalism has non sort of rational scientific sources as well that have to do with dignity. There can be religious ones, there can be other sources to liberalism. Conservatism oftentimes, and I say in the book, by the way, like the book it rotates the different ideologies and shows pressure points in all of them. So, you know, it's very much not just what's wrong with liberalism. It's not a Patrick Deneen book. It's what are the limits of all our ideologies. And in some sense, the goal of the book is to make everyone fall less in love with their ideologies. And be able to see another ideology a little bit better. And conservatives tend to grow up in a culture in which the present, as I say, is viewed as kind of a summit or pinnacle point on an invisible past, and a very difficult to achieve or maintain. I grew up in the Mountain West in Colorado, and there's this moss here called lichen. I now live in California, and lichen grows in these high tundra rocks, and if you step on it, you know, you can kill it. It grows so tiny. It's beautiful, by the way, but you know, you step on it and like centuries can be wiped out or decades can be wiped out in 1 minute. That's kind of how conservatives think about the present. They think really good things are really fragile. And so their beef with liberals and the left tends to be, oh, these people want to like break or change things fast. They want to experiment fast. But there's this really delicate life world that we shouldn't change too quickly because the good things in it are very fragile. And I think Roger Scruton, who's big in, you know, the UK, he even says there's a kind of melancholic disposition. I would call it an ethical magnetism to conservatism. You look at someone like T.S. Eliot, there's can sometimes be a pose of almost melancholy, like grand good things are in the past and we're holding on to a few good things now against the waves of modernity or something like that. That's a culture that's learned though, and you can grow up, say, in I don't know, a small church community or a small town or a milieu or a family where there's that kind of nostalgia or sense of melancholy about the modern world, that there were great things in the past and we're just barely holding on to the candle here in the wasteland, to take T.S. Eliot's term, to the next thing. But here's the real mind benders. You can convert in and out of the different cultures. And that's almost impossible to hear in an age of polarization, but people can actually move in. And so I don't think it's a natural disposition. It doesn't happen as often anymore, but you can go from the sort of liberal to conservative disposition. You can take on board that. And people do all the time. You know, we don't talk about it very much, and it's become rare due to certain social pressures. But it happens all the time. You can take up the new mode or cultural form.
Right. And what's the deal with the whole left? We're kind of presented with this political spectrum where you have like a left side and a right side. And on the really, really far left, you have like communism, and then a bit more towards the center, you have socialism, and then liberalism is kind of in the center, and then conservatism is a bit to the right of that, and fascism a bit to the right of that. I mean, you kind of talk a little bit about how this sort of mental model, or this sort of like chart, is actually kind of throws people out, is actively unhelpful, right, in making sense of the ideologies.
Yeah, I do. And this is another really good example of what you were talking about earlier, which is, the sort of spectrum model of ideology is sometimes presented as a mere factual social
Yeah,
scientific artifact, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah,
I'm just
absolutely.
locating people. But one
Yeah.
thing I say in the book is this is another case where the data is actually pre-interpreted, or the facts are pre-interpreted. And the placement on the spectrum has a certain push at the holistic level toward liberalism seeming the most reasonable. And in
Yeah, it's
fact,
it's in
this
the middle. It's balanced, liberalism in the middle. Yeah, you guys are extremists or whatever, right? Yeah,
Yeah, you tip too much to the right, you get to be kind of crazy, fascist. You tip too much to the left, you get to be crazy communist. But and in fact, historically, that model of the spectrum was developed during the Cold War, and obviously has earlier roots in the whole French parliamentary thing, where some people are saying on the left, some people on the right. But it really gets sharpened up when fascism and all that burst in the 20th century, as a kind of way that Cold War liberals try to understand, the political spatialization. My issue with it, I agree. I don't actually have a better replacement language for it, but I think it's a bad picture that's sort of holding us captive in various ways, because since I think ideologies are cultural traditions, I think they're capable of what I call liquidity or hybridization in the book. And that's very hard for us to see. And it's one of the reasons we're so disoriented right now, is because a lot of new stuff's happening in ideology where things combine that we think shouldn't be able to combine because they're too far apart on the spatial spectrum. So people are starting to recognize this. But for instance, ecologism or green politics, at least in the United States, often thought of as a left thing. It came about with the 60s and so on. But then what disappears is ecological pastoralism, say something like J.R.R. Tolkien, like the medieval world, or farming. And, you see this in Lord of the Rings, like, it would be better if we were pre-industrial, the orcs are industrial, et cetera, the hobbits are living in the Shire. But you can also like eco-fascisms, I mean, there were eco-fascisms in Hitler's Germany. And so but my point is that, or feminism is another one, that what the problem with the spectrum thing is, a lot of things. One, it looks like the picture that was developed by liberals that favors liberalism as rational and moderate
What
and
are
in the middle.
what's the unit meant to be on the x-axis there? Like, what are the units on the spectrum
Yeah,
actually? Because
I think
if
they're.
I kind of think of it, it's like, yeah, maybe some private property type of thing, but that's not quite it. Maybe some like
Yeah,
freedom thing, but that's not quite
yeah,
it. Like,
yeah.
I mean, what's your best guess at like what the unit is supposed to be?
Units of it's great. I mean, units of individual freedom, possibly collectivism on both sides. But it is one of these cases where what we were talking about earlier. People are trying to see what's so great about the natural sciences and math, and sort of do the same thing to politics by having a graph and having like countables, and that politics isn't always amenable to that. I think we'd be better to make a humanistic paradigm shift where instead we look at genre types, the recurrence of tropes and meanings and family resemblances. And then what we'd see, as I say in the book, is that ideologies are probably closer to like a splatter painting by Jackson Pollock, where colors can emerge on different sides. In fact, socialism can combine with conservatism, and liberalism can combine with fascism. As weird as that is, maybe that's what went on with Pinochet, a neoliberal authoritarian or something like that. But we would be less lost in ideology if we had more interpretive sensitivity to the liquidity and hybridization of ideologies. And my beef with the left-right spectrum, I don't have a better replacement language, and I think we're sort of stuck with it for various reasons. But maybe someone will make a leap forward where we come up with a better organizing metaphor for these reasons, because the spectrum also teaches us that certain things can't mix that in fact can mix, because there's things in between them on the spectrum. So how could it mix?
Yeah.
And that's
What,
just
what do
false. Yeah.
what do people mean by fascism, by the way? I feel like, I mean, look, I was born in 1995, so like I wasn't around for like whatever happened in the 1900s, for the most part. But it seems like it's kind of now morphed into this sort of insult that's slung around to various people. Oh, Trump's a fascist. This guy's a fascist. Like what actually, can you explain fascism a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very influenced by a literature that says that fascism, the best way to think about fascism is ultranationalism. And what distinguishes it
Okay.
from conservatism is conservatives are committed to sort of a gradualism in politics. And you could
What does
think of
that mean?
fascism, meaning that you don't change too much precisely because the present is so much the accumulation of past wisdom and customs.
Okay. Okay.
You
Yeah.
don't change things fast. And also, any kind of authority in society is limited by custom and tradition. So you don't elect people who break from the customs and morals of the existing traditions. They don't have absolute power, at least in
Mm.
Burkean conservatism. The limit on power is tradition and custom. It's not liberal
Okay.
rights. It's you can't have people acting against the moral code of the tradition of society.
Okay.
Fascism it tells a different story. It tells a story about a catastrophe so big, and it can often pull in conservatives, but can also pull in socialists, or people like Mussolini was a socialist. But there's a catastrophe so big that you need to almost have like a revolutionary action, but of the right, of restoration, backward towards some golden period in the nation. And there can be often racialized fascisms, ethnic fascisms. They don't have to be. It's a culture. It can combine with other things. But fascism has a story. You could think of it as a kind of revolutionaryism of the right. And so it shares some
But I don't really
aspect.
understand what the right. I mean, as we've established, I don't really
Yeah.
understand what the right is. So, like, what is
Yeah.
it? What is like it? What is it an extreme version of? Because it doesn't seem like just an extreme version of like the conservative thing.
Right. Well, okay. So it's a restoration of a particularist nation or group,
Okay.
whereas a lot of the ideologies that, yes, with our language that is, we should take with a massive grain of salt, but we don't have a good replacement clustering for. But a lot of the politics of the left tend to be universalistic and make rationalist claims about the emancipation of human beings
Okay.
in general.
Yep. Yep.
And oftentimes, this, by the way, this gets blown up by things like identity politics, et cetera. But oftentimes, right, conservative ideology, for instance, defends a particular tradition, or nationalists
Oh,
defend a
okay. Okay.
particular
Yeah.
tradition. So when I say there's a movement toward revolutionary or radical restoration of the right, what I really mean, back off the right language, is of a particularist tradition or
Okay.
community or ethnic
They're
community.
not
Yeah.
attempting to sort of find some universal principles for organizing society or something. It's like, hey, we were these people in the past. We're not trying to figure out how that country over there should run themselves, but we are these people, and like this is what we should do, kind of thing.
Yeah, and also it's fascism is really fascinating. That has a backward-looking element, a forward-looking element to it. But one thing that distinguishes it, say, from socialism or Marxism, and one thing that makes it have family resemblances with conservatism, is the notion of a golden age, or that there's a sense in which there was a well-ordered past in which either the ethnic group or the religious group was supreme and well-ordered, and that needs to be restored by emergency in some way, right? So there's both this kind of future revolutionary, we need to,
Mm.
but it's restorationist, unlike, say, in left variants of revolutionary action, there's a total break from the past towards something new, like post-capitalism or something like that. So, Hitler is the Third Reich. Well, why is it the Third Reich? Well, there was a First and Second Reich. And Mussolini, it was Rome. I mean, this is weirdly, he thought of modern Italy as in continuity with the ancient Romans, which is already not very historical, but he thought that essentially like fascist Italy would be a restoration of sort of the well-orderedness of the Roman Empire, and hence he took all the iconography of it, et cetera, et cetera. So fascists have a story of ultra-nationalist sort of restoration, emergency restoration of a kind
Mm.
of golden age past, right? But
Okay.
you
Yeah.
might have to go outside the norms, unlike conservatives. You might have to
Yeah.
throw gradualism to the wind. You might have to be irreligious to make it happen, etc.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, I think I can sort of. I think growing up in the UK, no one's like, well, I guess some people are sort of pushing that kind of stuff now. I can sort of imagine that being like attractive, depending on my circumstances. If you're in certain set of circumstances, with the sort of yeah, I mean, I think one good thing that you do in the book is you kind of go through sort of the major, ideologies and sort of how they can kind of combine and sort of morph into new things, and you kind of try and sort of, I guess the sort of the tech bro term for this would be steel manning. Have you heard of this term, steel man? It's like
No,
the
you
opposite
see,
of
you keep teaching me terms. You
yeah,
taught me
yeah. So
psyop.
it's
Now I need to know steel manning. What's steel
yeah, so
manning?
it's kind of the opposite of straw manning, where
Ah,
a straw
uh-huh.
man is kind of like a
Got
stupid
it.
version of whatever thing you're
Yeah,
arguing against, whereas
I
steel
like
manning
this.
is trying to sort of make the best case for this thing. And so I think when you talk about being able to in order to sort of critique an ideology, it's no good standing at the top of your tower and yelling about like your concepts of like freedom or whatever it is. You have to be able to speak the language of the people in the other tower and kind of critique them on their own terms, ideally. So I think it's kind of a similar concept as this whole steel manning thing of like, you should be able to make the best case for this thing, even if you disagree with it, if you want to be able to have good discourse about it. And so I think for sort of for someone in my position, it's hard to imagine. Yeah, I guess I have less empathy for sort of what's ethically magnetic about communism. I mean, look, I'm not sort of super clued up on like communism, but my understanding is it's basically like sort of top down sort of state controlled equality, state enforced equality, or so something like this. It doesn't seem doesn't seem attractive. Can you sort
Right.
of yeah, do I have that
What?
right, by the way,
Are
about
you not
communism?
ethically attracted to Stalinism?
Right.
What's
So
wrong
yeah, I
with
mean,
you?
what's can you sort of like roughly sort of make the case for what
Yeah.
why someone might be attracted to that?
I think that, well, first of all the ideologies, once you see they're cultural, you'll see that there are many socialisms, many conservatisms, many
Right.
fascisms. They hybridize in different ways. So it's very difficult to narrate or tell the story. And that's what we're trying to do. Even when you ask me about fascism, I tried to give a very thumbnail sketch desperately of the story, that the rough
Mm.
family resemblances of the story that
Yeah,
you
yeah,
hear
yeah.
fascists tell. Now, the rough family resemblances of the story you hear socialists and communists tell, those can be distinguished as groups and there are different subvariants and whatnot, is that there's kind of unfinished business when it comes to the emancipation of individuals. That freedom is a historical accomplishment of the entire human species, and that you can track its sort of ascent, and that liberalism, it's often missed because often, in particular in the Marxist variant of communism, it sounds very anti-liberal. In fact, it's violent class warfare against the bourgeoisie and all this. But it's easy to miss that part of what in the Marxist variant Marxists are saying is that capitalism has actually achieved a sort of historically unprecedented level of emancipation because it's freed up sort of the material conditions, such that there is abundance. Marx says in the Communist Manifesto that it's the first time in history that we have a problem we've never ever had before, which is a crisis of abundance. And Marx's long story of history is that always before this, humans did not have enough materially against nature for everyone to have enough to flourish. But the problem of capitalism is for the first time you have more than enough for everyone to flourish. That's his contention. More than enough healthcare, more than enough food, more than enough education, more than enough housing. The problem becomes purely political, not economic with capitalism. It becomes that although everyone could have enough to flourish, only some people have it. And in fact, the very conception of liberal right and a liberal right to private property is standing in the way of flourishing. Back to the freedom issue, which I think is part of the guiding vision of communism, is if you could find a way to organize people politically beyond a liberal right, such that they didn't have just a right to non-interference, but they had the actual material conditions to completely self-fulfill. And so the way that Marxists tend to think about freedom is only some people are allowed to really be fully free in capitalist societies. There's a myth, ideology in the bad sense for them, of everyone has their rights, you can exit contracts, et cetera, et cetera. But in truth, only really rich people can exit contracts, do what they want, get a job they find fulfilling, et cetera, et cetera. And
Yeah.
in a way, it's almost like that kind of freedom is thought to be needed to be democratized for everyone, a freedom where you could have fulfillment at your job, leave a contract if you didn't like it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a kind of like very thumbnail sketch of steel manning aspects of communism. Of course, one of the ironies of communism historically in its Marxist variant is that then it has flipped, historically into these regimes you were describing before. But being a political ideological tradition, in order to steelman it, there's no one and done with any of the ideological traditions. They can reconstitute themselves and sort of like re-articulate themselves around their problems, and all of them have problems. And a big one for Marx is, well, the revolution is either permanently postponed, or when it's happened, it happened in places Marx said it wouldn't happen. They were pre-industrial, and it happened in ways that were very top-down and bureaucratic, whereas Marx was saying there was going to be all this sort of flourishing of sort of almost an anarchic post-state, So all that to say, there remain like kind of live problems, but my view of the different ideological traditions is they all, if you really stop in humility and listen and you steelman them, as you're saying, you'll hear the ethical call. It might not mean you become that ideology, but you'll actually see or understand why humans are recruited to the map,
Yep.
and you'll understand better the ideological terrain around you.
Yep. Okay, so that's kind of one of the ways that in which people can have productive debates about ideology is to sort of critique another ideology on its own terms, that the other person would accept because they hold that ideology. The other way that you sort of mention is, you can find something else that has normative force for like both of you, maybe, some, sort of something that really is sort of settled science that everyone would agree on. Do you see much of that happening, of like, people sort of changing ideological positions, for sort of, or ideologies sort of morphing because there is there's some new science that kind of means that they can't really have a position that they had before or something like that. It obviously it seems good in theory, but like, does that actually happen?
Not often. It's an empirical question, why people change. I mean, my theory commits me to the idea that the way ideologies work is through a strong form of ethical recruitment that takes in our identity, our sense of purpose, mission, vocation as people. One that in the book that I say the natural sciences, because I want to be careful to just, I'm not
Yes,
contradicting
that's what I
myself
meant.
here. Like, the natural sciences can help us every once in a while with ideological questions. As I say in the book, I don't think it's very often, precisely because the ethical visions are so demanding and so big that they exceed any one fact and can reaccommodate themselves to the best scientific account. But one that I think is very bad on this score is white supremacy. The idea that, in biology, the notion that there are subspecies or subtypes of humans that are cut along racial lines is, bogus pseudoscience. And yet, white supremacy persists. So one answer to that would be like, let's get everyone a science education so that they see that this is a pseudoscience. But the problem with that, and I quote James Baldwin, the great, writer here in the United States on this, is that I think that white supremacy is working more at an ethical level. James Baldwin says somewhere that the reason it's so important for people to be white is because it's so important for them to not be black. And I think that gets at something really profound about what makes this ideology tick, which is a sense of sort of restoration or participation or pride in something bigger than you, right? And I really think white supremacy works at that register. Is I may not feel self-respect. I may feel put down in some way, or have some, hobgoblin on my back for whatever reason. But hey, if I'm white, I participate in like Mozart and, a great civilization and tradition that restores my sense of self. Whereas if you're, and then fill in the blank, you don't.
Right.
You're
Yep.
beneath us caste wise. So I think scientific arguments, the reason they don't get us very far is precisely because the nature of ideologies is that they're cultural and meaning traditions. And a lot of what attaches people to them has to do with this deeper spiritual, even sense of what's meaningful in life. And that's what you've got to get at if you really want to unfasten someone from white supremacy. Because either they'll make bad faith arguments on the science, or they'll, make some ad hoc argument, or, but what's my contention is what attaches people to ideology is at a bigger level than any one set of facts that you can
Right.
marshal.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Right.
Not to say it might not be helpful, by the way. And there, you might occasionally run into someone who really is trying to follow the science and got into some sort of pseudoscientific rabbit hole on, genetics or something like that. But I just think that's very rare. I think usually something else is going on with the human person in ideology.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of my sort of observations, just from just from Twitter. Let's be real. That's kind of my main sort of. That's sort of the public square now, I guess.
Yeah.
It seems like when people have these discussions, it feels like the sort of discussion, the discussion is happening at the level of like propositions. It's at the level of like proposition A versus proposition B, and then there'll be a sort of thing about like these propositions, but like no, as you've said, like it's rare for someone to actually kind of become part of a certain ideology because of a set of because that ideology has a set of propositions which follow from whatever. Yeah, I guess what do you think more healthy ideological debate looks like? Because I think the form it takes is this sort of like, as if people try and argue about it as if it's like, hey, I believe proposition A, and I believe proposition A because I believe this because of this other, premise, and then from that I deduce that, we argue in this sort of very rational seeming way, but we're not really taking into account the background picture that is being assumed by
Yeah.
like each person, so but it's hard to imagine not arguing in that sort of propositional way, because I mean it's just kind of a line. I mean, if you're typing something out, like I don't know,
Yeah.
it's just kind of like a sort of easy way to lay something out. Do you see what I'm getting at? Like
Yeah.
we clearly
Absolutely.
want to sort of engage in this kind of, I mean, I guess this is kind of one of McIntyre's shticks about sort of moral discourse, where we certainly seem to want to have moral disagreements in this kind of rational way, but from our, I think you said, like, from our rival conclusions we can argue back to our sort of rival starting points,
Hmm.
and at that point it's like, you think some premise is like intuitive and a natural starting point. I think a different premise is intuitive and a natural starting point. And so we're at this like, we're at this sort of unargued disagreement, and all we can do at this point is yell at each other. Like, how do we get out of that? Like, for example, on Twitter, for example, like how can, if there's a listener who enjoys getting into, or finds themselves, whether they enjoy it or not, getting into political disagreements, ideological disagreements, how can you break out of this like pseudo rational frame, which and get to sort of a more productive way of approaching that discussion? Does that make sense? I feel like I rambled a bunch there.
No, it absolutely makes sense. I was just trying to think of an example of that, and for some reason, and this is definitely to step on all the landmines, but why not? Like take all the arguments that are happening right now in our societies about sexuality and gender. So you'll have, one side just say, well, a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and it's a biological fact. And
Yeah.
you'll have the other side say, well, sexual nonconformity is part of a healthy sexuality, like one that doesn't conform to pre-established cultural, gender roles, is a healthy sexuality. So if you impose that, that's unhealthy medically. And so you have both sides sort of saying,
Yeah.
look, it's just science.
Yeah.
There's a man
It's
and woman.
biology. It's that.
It's just science. That I think a more productive, and by the way, that goes absolutely nowhere. Except people get more and more angry at how irrational the other side is, and also how wicked and bad faith they are. And I think a better step would be, okay, we're marshaling like these data or facts at each other, but what about the interpretive significances behind it? Why what I hear there is a different vision of what it looks like to be a healthy sexual being. And what I hear conservatives saying is there's a health in complementarity, there's a need for complementarity between the sexes. And then I hear people, liberals, saying there's a need for a healthy sexuality that doesn't have to immediately conform to past
Right. Yeah.
customs, that allows for
Yep.
expression, et cetera, et cetera. We would have more progress instead of just throwing the facts at each other's head. If we start to have an argument about why do you find it significant, why is it meaningful to
Mm.
you, what do you see a value there for a life well lived
Yeah. What's at stake
in
for you here? Yeah.
yeah, in nonconformity versus in a kind of growth in tradition. What do
Mm.
you see as different there, and what's at stake
Mm.
for you, right? Because honestly, I think it's like one of these cases where I love Shakespeare. The lady doth protest too much, and both ladies are protesting way too much because there's a sense in which the marshaling of mere biology by conservatives, if gender didn't bend at all, then there wouldn't be anything to fight about. You
Right.
know,
Yeah. They
on the
prefer that
other
option.
hand, if gender bends, then why can't it be channeled into tradition? You know? So on both sides, it's like the biology isn't quite doing the work that people think it's doing, in my opinion. And we're having a bad argument. We should be having an
Mm.
argument about the background stories. My hope, this might be a wild, crazy hope, is that humanistically speaking, people who had an argument about the stories would get to see, okay, this might not be quite as bad as I initially thought, and there might be a space for different kinds of human witness here or
Mm.
possibility. Now, that might be just like my own little wild hope. That's not something I talk about in the book, but one thing I do talk about in the book is I hope to recover the existential space.
Mm.
One thing I really want people to see is insofar as there's a pre-ideological space, it's that we're all meaning-making creatures with the same problem, which is how do we lead a good life, both as individuals and as a community. And
Mm.
even if you absolutely detest the other side, they have that problem too. They also have that existential meaning-making problem. And so, that sort of existential space is I would hope is a space that at least gives us one foot outside of ideology, even if it doesn't allow us to get rid of ideology. And it's a space for exploration. I try to write the book within that space for exploration. Obviously, I have my own ideological commitments, but the commitments in the book are sort of existential ones about our meaning making capacities that I'm trying to get people to see. Yeah.
How can people get better at this? I mean, Ali and I were talking a few episodes ago, and he kind of was saying like, look, man, why do I need to sort of I don't have that much free time, I can't afford to like sit around and
Yeah.
like get up to date with like the last 1,000 years of the Western tradition, and then get up to date with the modern sort of debates around politics, and then then figure out who to vote for. Like, I just don't have the time. I don't have the time to
That's
that.
funny.
Like, for that, why can't I just like rely on my friend who's pretty knowledgeable about this stuff or whatever? Like, I think everyone, I think he's kind of being a bit extreme there, maybe, but I think everyone feels
Yeah.
that to some extent of like,
Oh
oh
yeah.
my God, there's like a bajillion. I mean, is this kind of is this? I guess this is a sort of more modern problem where because of sort of globalization, because of sort of internet and the printing press, like we are confronted with sort of such a big array of ideological options in a way that I guess like 1,000 years ago, if you kind of were in your little city state or whatever, and you never really left, and like you wouldn't really be, that you wouldn't have this sort of existential problem of like, oh man, like my neighbor who's basically very similar to me in like 100 different
Right.
ways. It's like very different to me on this one thing. Like maybe could I be wrong on this? It feels like am I right that this is quite a sort of
Yeah.
modern existential issue?
Yeah, I do think that that is the case, that sociologically we find ourselves less able to occupy a position of sort of the automaticness of our politics. Try to double down. That's what I call lost in ideology, but it's very hard to live that way. And I'm sorry, and you were saying that what
Yeah, so
exactly?
how, I mean, how, yeah, practically speaking, for a
Yeah.
listener of the podcast who
Oh,
doesn't want to
yes.
be lost in
Right.
ideology,
Yeah.
how can they learn the language? How does one learn the
Oh,
language of rival ideology and sort of really, understand it in that way?
yeah. Good. And I think that I would. So there's the kind of mean answer and there's the nice answer. The mean philosophical answer is the world we live in is already an artifact of politics and ideology, and the fact that we don't have any time to think about politics is already a sort of expressive of that politics. So what do we have time
Ah,
for? Making money?
okay.
Yeah, Rousseau
Right.
says finance is a slave's word. I don't know how that's going to fall on your listeners' ears, but once you say the word finance, in other words, I don't have time for laws or politics, what you're basically saying is please rule me and give me my laws and I'll just go do finance. But
Right, yeah.
essentially, you're going to be subject to the lawgiver. So the mean answer is, and by the way, I feel it too. Like we don't have time for politics. I mean, practically don't have time to vote. I don't have time to. But that's itself maybe the process of a kind of neoliberalization and certain
Mm.
erosion of leisure that we don't have as much democracy as we used to, or whatever. That's the sort of mean answer, or it's like. And do you not care about the good life? You could give a kind of Socratic answer. What could possibly matter more, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
The nicer answer is, we're all finite. We all have areas we excel at. Humans have different talents, and by the way, wonderful that they do because then people can do different things for each other in a community. But I do think that one can sort of deliberate or prudentially discern what are the other ideologies you're rubbing up against in your life. Either politically, they've come to the fore because electorally there's a wave and you're like, what the heck is that? Or more often, you have a neighbor, a friend, a coworker that you don't get what makes them tick, but there they are. They're given to you. Far from, you can say you don't have time, but like they're in your life. And so what are you going to do about that? And so I would say to the person who's pressed for time, as I myself am as well, it's not about learning the whole history of the West. It's about learning to understand the people who are given to you. And that doesn't mean understanding every one of the ideologies. Maybe you don't. I mean, I'm a scholar of this. I focus on this. But if you want to understand the people that are given to you, you're going to have to understand, and that might be different ideologies for you, but the ones that are presented in front of you. And so some of them can be quite shocking politically. Like, here in the United States, obviously everyone's thinking about Trumpism and all that. Well, yeah, then let's understand that's what's given right now. So let's try to understand that better.
Mm.
But it might be something else in the UK, and it might be something even different for you in the United States because your daughter just married someone who has a politics you think is insane. So that's an invitation into understanding them.
Do you have an even nicer answer, which is like, you know, apart from reading your book, which I guess would be the best answer to this question,
Yeah.
like how are there any websites, books, blogs that you think, is there some like, really good blog, I think probably most of the people listening to this podcast are some kind of liberal. Are there any good magazines, journals, blogs, whatever, from a conservative point of view that, they could peruse, like, anything like that?
I'm very big, and I do this in the book. I'm very big on going back to sort of canonical expressions or most articulate expressions of an ideology, often found in
Okay.
philosophers, sometimes found in poets or
Right.
literary people. So when I'm doing progressivism in the United States, there's Joni Mitchell is in there, Bob Dylan is in there with liberalism. When I'm doing conservatism, I think I mentioned Evelyn Waugh, T.S. Eliot. And I do that for two reasons. One is the most articulate version is what you're calling steel manning them. So you get the strongest version on offer, not just some, because I'm a little skeptical. So now you go to a blog or something like that, and then
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
it's a weak version, right?
Right, yeah.
But also I do that for a second reason, which is once you enter into ideological debate, you can often, people are more often than not empirical claim, but like not that coherent on their ideologies. And there's a little of this
Yeah.
and there's a little of that. But you can correct back to the ideal articulator that is an authority within
Okay,
their
right,
own
right.
tradition, right? So,
Yeah.
but I would say, yeah, you could plunder the book's bibliography for
Okay.
in each of the ideological traditions. There's almost like a reading list behind my book
Okay. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
I think is a really good reading list. Yeah, if you find someone that you think is smart in the popular sphere and is speaking from a
Mm.
point of view you don't understand, I think it would be worth stopping as a rule of thumb and listening longer and trying to find out what's going on there and why they think the way they do. Absolutely. Instead of doubling back into our bubble, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I
But
don't
it
have
sounds like
anything,
you're
yeah, top of mind per se right now.
sure. It sounds like you're in favor of just kind of going back to the sort of, the primary texts, of whatever thinkers, was sort of the starting point of these things.
I'm hearing the question there of like, time as well. And the part of the problem is I have a very critical view of ideological debate right now. And one of the reasons I don't run to saying read this blog or that blog is I think that most people are lost in ideology right now,
Yeah,
meaning
for
they
sure.
just think their ideological language is obvious and that's the way they talk. There's
Right.
probably something to be learned by visiting the various tribes, ideological tribes, and just listening to the sheer gobsmacking provinciality of all the members of it as they speak as though their sermon is blindingly obvious, but with a grain of salt. That's I don't I don't see, this might be completely the United States, but I don't see a lot of people who are speaking with a kind of greater awareness of themselves politically in this sense. I mean, I always
Okay.
recommend Charles Taylor. I always recommend Alistair McIntyre. I can throw those guys out. But then I'm hearing the time thing.
Okay.
Like, that's actually, Charles Taylor writes a 500-page book every time he writes a book. So I don't know if that's going to help you.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice. I've got some just more. Well, actually, one thing I want to go back to is epistemological angst of like, how can I really know this stuff? Like how, what are my views really grounded in, kind of thing. Uh, you know, I think, I mean, I think a lot of people feel that, and then they're just like, whatever, I've just got to live my life, and like, I just don't, that question is going to stay, a question. I'm not going to settle that question or something. What's like an alternative frame to that sort of, just what's sort of an alternative way to approach the world than the view from nowhere foundation? Everything needs to be
Mhm.
grounded in these sort of indubitable foundational premise,
Mhm.
etc. Like, what's the way out, man?
Yeah, I think it's recognizing we're all already living out different cultural traditions and then waiting for reality to interrupt you because it will. That's the thing is, I actually don't believe in, to the complacent person, I just say wait because, I'm going to be 44 soon and life has a way of disrupting our complacency. There are times where things seem more lax, but these kind of questions come crashing in, usually through very specific relationships with very specific people. And what I would say at that moment is pay attention to those moments and be in a state of also listening. And there might be some growth for you too, and for me too. But the complacency is so hard to keep up over an entire lifetime that it basically is something that is impossible to carry out, I think. And life itself will disrupt you. And then I would say listen during the disruption. Don't become reactive and shut down into like the sort of bubble again, which is what most people do nowadays. Listen for the other tradition, listen for the other existential problem of trying to work out what a good life, what a good society is. Listen for that. Listen for the stories people are telling, you know. Um, Even if you find yourself in the unfortunate case of, oh, here my family member is a white supremacist, or I mean, I pity anyone who has that situation, but at the same time, like, if you don't listen to the story of how they got there, how are they ever going to get unhooked from that?
Mm,
You're not going to really
right.
understand them, and what makes them tick.
Okay. Nice. More random question from me, before we start to wrap up. What's the deal with this whole phenomenology stuff? I've heard you kind of talk about it occasionally on more academic type podcasts and things. Yeah, can you? What does it mean? Should
Yeah.
I be interested in it?
Yes. Well, if you've been interested in the book, you've been interested in phenomenology because phenomenology is
Ah,
basically a tradition of philosophy. Goes back to Edmund Husserl, goes through Heidegger, Gadamer, Charles Taylor, and so on. But the basic idea is that you start philosophy from the what is sometimes called the first person perspective. To your point about the view from nowhere, it's
okay. So it's
the
kind of the opposite to that.
it's the opposite starting point where phenomenologists try to theorize and give an account of the sort of pre-existing I don't really want to call them structures, but maybe conditions or possibilities of experience are. And this book
What does
is
that? What does that mean?
so, for instance, like what are the preconditions of being a self? And
Okay.
Heidegger says in Being and Time that a self, always cares, is in a state of care, caring about something, right? Like there's
Okay.
a state
Sure.
of
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
care
Yeah.
about the world, and you can actually see some of that in my book because so my point that like we're always already in ideology is a version of the thesis that we're always in a state of care. We care about something significant for us. Let me put this in plainer
Yeah.
language. Humans always have a meaning issue. Part of the conditions of our experience is meaning.
Mm.
And if you try to subtract out to the view from nowhere, all you'll do is naively reproduce meanings. You'll think you're out in the stars or out in the galaxy or a vanishingly small point that doesn't exist. But in
Yeah.
fact, your history will be coming through, it'll be shooting through that little
Yeah.
vanishing point that doesn't exist. And the book is a phenomenology. I say it, actually, the publisher's like, can you please take that out of the text?
Stop saying that word. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's like footnote number. I have the book here. It's like footnote number 9. I'm like, this is a phenomenology of ideology that I'm conducting. Oh yeah, footnote 9. I am attempting, in my own words, to an adequate phenomenology of ideology, and all that means is that what is it like account of having an ideology, and the what it's
Okay.
like account is what it feels like to have an ideology, what the experience of ideology is like. And that's why I developed these philosophical concepts around it. It's ethically magnetic, they're liquid, they're world making, et cetera, et cetera. But that's an attempt at sort of
Okay.
this philosophical approach. It's a first person experience, the what it's like to have an ideology. Yeah.
Interesting. Is it worth? I mean, if I'm interested in this kind of, I feel like you have a sense of what I'm interested in. Is it worth me sort of going deeper on phenomenology as such, or like, you know, it sounds like the book has already, taken that
Yeah,
approach, and so it's,
you've been red pilled or whatever it is. You've been the
hey,
psyop is up or no.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, depending on how philosophy curious you are, I would certainly say that it's worth it because a lot of the philosophical resistance to the view from nowhere comes from an attempt to understand social and human reality from within experience, right? And so it's the source of existential philosophy for people who are interested in that. And part of the claim of existential philosophy when it first appeared in Europe was that it wasn't an academic philosophy. I mean, it's even in that term, it's become like a cartoon and a farce of itself. But existentialism means like the central questions that matter to you, not the sort of are you a mind in a vat questions, but the stuff everyone deals with in their
mm,
experience. So
yeah,
anyone who wants to go deeper into phenomenology, I think, is going deeper into the what it's like to be human and what matters to us. The person I would recommend again is just Charles Taylor, Sources of the Self, A Secular Age. Those are his two masterworks. They're massive, though, so I mean, you prepare yourself to read. But Source of the Self starts with the phenomenology of modern selfhood. Some of the stuff we were talking about,
okay,
disengagement and everything.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
out
yeah,
of
yeah.
Taylor, yeah. But
Yeah, I've started. I have started reading sources of stuff. Yeah, I mean, I feel like almost every page I was like, "Wow, how can he articulate this so so well? It's crazy." Yeah. Okay, cool. So I think I'll stick with that then. I don't know if I don't know if I need to go back to Husserl or whatever other people.
no, I wouldn't go back to Husserl. No,
Okay,
you can start with Taylor. Heidegger's
cool.
been sullied by his commitments to Nazism and things, rightly so,
Oh yeah, I've
probably.
heard about this. Yeah, yeah. Cool, nice. So what do you? I think maybe we can start to wrap up. What do you? What do you see as like your general project anyway? I mean, I guess there's a bit of a theme with your previous book, We Built Reality,
Yeah.
and this book around wanting to make people more aware of when, different things are being smuggled into, science, for example, or
Mhm.
just, the natural way the world is, like what yeah, I guess like what do you see as your sort of overall project that you're attempting here?
A revival of humanism against scientism. A revival of like human experience in all its facets. I think it's a very bad modern habit to try to subtract subject dependent things like meanings and
Mm,
experience, and then, oh, we really got it to it. And I think it has a lot of bad effects on politics and ethical life to do that. And I think
and
it's
how would you define
yeah,
how would you define scientism just for like listeners?
the overextension of scientific authority to where it doesn't belong. So I
Okay.
think I'm someone who's very respectful actually of scientific authority within its domain.
Yeah.
But when you extend science to supposedly resolve problems for you that are, like we were saying, existential or political or ethical, that's beyond the competence of science. And that's what I call scientism. And I think it's something that is endemic in modern culture, and I think it's a real, I love this phrase by the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein: the purpose of philosophy is to let the flies out of the fly bottle, and so in other words, we're trapped. Something we can do as scholars, philosophers, political philosophers is, I don't have the Platonic view that I come to you with the laws and here you go, everybody. No, my view is I can sometimes, if I see something through my learning where we're stuck and it's like a pseudo problem, maybe we can help get unstuck.
Okay. Yeah.
People like me, humanists, can help us get unstuck, and I'm trying to get people unstuck. Wittgenstein says a picture held us captive. That's a very famous phrase of his.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think a picture holds us captive. The picture is
Mm,
scientism, and against that, I would want to revive humanism.
nice. So what's next on that journey? Are you like working on another book? Like, are you just sort of teaching and seeing what ideas pop into your head? And yeah, how do you
I'm working on a couple other books. One is about a politics that retains the notion of like an ideal politics, but also a practically actionable politics as a form of world making. And the other is very beginning grounds, but is attempt to like combine autobiography with arguments about why you can't have reductive notions of self. So like a story of myself, but that at the same time tells a philosophical story about why I shouldn't understand myself as just like a mechanics or a computer or
Mm,
something like that. So I have
yeah.
those two book projects going on, but they're very slow right now. I'm having trouble finding time for them.
Okay. Yeah. Too busy in the ideological arena.
Actually, too busy with, I have two kids. I have a
Oh, nice.
newborn.
Oh, congrats.
I've got admin stuff. So if some time opens up, I'm working on them, but it's slower than I'd like. Yeah.
Nice. And where can people keep up with you online, etc., to hear about your latest stuff?
I suppose I'm on X, but I've been less on X recently. But I still am there, and I suppose I'm on YouTube. I mostly post Charles Taylor stuff on there. I suppose I'm on TikTok. I have no idea what I'm doing on there.
Oh, really? You're on TikTok?
Yeah, I have no idea what I'm doing on TikTok. Are you on TikTok?
I'm not really on TikTok. I mean, I think in the pandemic, I had a phase where I was just spending like way too much time on there, and I just deleted the app, and like, it was
Yeah,
too powerful. Yeah, I can't deal with that.
too powerful.
Maybe
Yeah,
if
but wait.
if you're on my feed, I'll spend even more time on TikTok. So all the more reason not to. Cool. All right. Well, Jason, great to hang out, man. Thanks again. All the best with the various kids and books, and I hope we get to do this at some point soon.
Thank you. And yeah, I always love your questions. They're smart, but they also come from sort of a perspective that is more grounded in outside of academia, and I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time. Also, I've now stopped the thing, so I think we just have to wait around for the files to upload.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks for that, man.